demon worship, and a village's darkest curse. In a haunted village, rumors circulate of a curse upon its residents, a legacy of ancient rituals. The story begins with an eerie scream echoing through the silent night, chilling the village to its core. Jonathan, a seasoned elder, is called to the scene where the lifeless body of young Lily, a girl of only 18, hangs ominously from the ceiling. Fear grips the villagers as they discover sinister cuts on her body, signs of a dark influence. Jonathan urges everyone to avoid the corpse, warning of a lurking evil. Yet, secrets of the village's curse unravel slowly. Jonathan recalls a prophecy foretold by an old soothsayer. Impending doom will fall upon the village, claiming lives in its wake. With tension thickening, Jonathan leaves in search of a mysterious exorcist known only as the Sage. The villagers, restless and horrified, attempt to bury Lily's corpse, but they are unaware of the consequences of defying ancient warnings. The cursed soil trembles as the villagers are thrust into a harrowing battle with the forces of the underworld, where every wrong step threatens to unleash a darkness that will consume them all. Part 1. The ominous scream. The night was quiet, almost unnaturally so. It was a thick, oppressive silence that blanketed the small village, wrapping each home in an eerie calm. The crickets had stilled, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the night itself sensed something terrible lurking just beyond the shadows. Then, piercing the silence, a scream shattered the stillness, raw and filled with utter terror. It echoed through the village, reverberating off the thatched roofs, twisting around trees, and finding its way into every crack and crevice. It was a scream so filled with agony, so human yet so unnatural, that it clawed at the hearts of anyone who heard it. Eyes widened in the dark, breaths held as shivers crept up spines, leaving goosebumps in their wake. Jonathan, the village elder, was jolted awake by the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. A man of 60 years, seasoned by hardship and sorrow, he was not easily shaken. But tonight he felt a dread he hadn't known since he was a boy. Something about that scream held an unearthly terror, something that pulled him up from his bed and sent him stumbling for his lantern with hands that trembled far more than he would have liked. The streets were dark, barely illuminated by the sliver of a waning moon. Jonathan's lamp cast a faint, flickering light, just enough to make out the winding path ahead. As he hurried down the path, he could feel something watching him, lurking just beyond the edges of his vision. But when he turned, there was nothing but the empty village, cloaked in darkness. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with a strange smell. He couldn't place a mixture of decay and something older, something that prickled the back of his neck. When he reached a small house at the edge of the village, his breath caught. The door was slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness gaping in the weak lantern light. He hesitated, a sense of foreboding settling in his gut. His instincts told him to turn back, to leave whatever horror awaited inside unseen. But he couldn't. He was the elder, the one everyone looked to in times of crisis. With a deep, shuddering breath, he pushed open the door. Inside, the room was dim, filled with shadows that seemed to shift and move as the lantern's light flickered. And there, hanging from the central beam, was Lily. Her body swayed gently, as though a light breeze touched it, though no wind stirred. She was young, only 18, with a future she had often dreamed about, a life she had only just begun. Now, her face was pale, her eyes closed, lips parted slightly as if frozen in a final, unspoken word. Her dark hair fell in limp strands around her, framing her face in a way that made her look like some tragic, broken doll. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat, his stomach churning with a wave of nausea. He took a shaky step back, the lantern shaking in his grasp. The dim light cast strange, shifting shadows across Lily's face, making it look as though her eyes might open, as if her lips might curl into a twisted smile. His hands trembled, a mixture of horror and sorrow overwhelming him. This wasn't right. This wasn't a simple tragedy. It felt like a violation, a mark left by something dark, something beyond human understanding. Behind him, more villagers began to gather, their faces pale in the dim lantern light. Whispers filled the air, hushed and fearful, as they took in the sight of young Lily's body hanging from the beam. A woman in the crowd stifled a scream, pressing her hands over her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. An old man muttered a prayer, clutching a worn talisman around his neck. Mothers pulled their children close, shielding them from the sight, Though the damage was already done, their young eyes wide with a terror they could neither understand nor forget. As the crowd grew, Jonathan held up a hand, his voice barely a whisper yet firm with authority. "Stay back, no one touches her." His words hung heavy in the air, and the crowd fell silent, eyes turning to him with a mixture of fear and expectation. They looked to him for answers, for guidance, but he had none to give. His mind raced, each thought more frantic than the last. He knew Lily's death wasn't just a tragic end. There was something sinister here, something that lingered in the air, curling around their feet like tendrils of smoke, a presence that weighed heavily on his chest. He remembered Lily as she was in life, bright-eyed, full of dreams, her laughter a familiar melody that drifted through the village on sunny afternoons. She was always kind, the sort of girl who left flowers on doorsteps for those who had suffered a recent loss, or shared what little she had with those who needed it. To see her like this, a pale, twisted figure in the shadowed room, was an abomination, a perversion of everything she had been. As he stood there, struggling to understand, a faint movement caught his eye. His heart pounded as he glanced upward, only to realize that it was the rope, swaying ever so slightly as if in a final, mocking lullaby. It was a tiny motion, barely perceptible, but it filled him with a visceral terror. His mind raced back to old legends, whispered tales of spirits that never rested, of curses that lingered for generations, passed down like dark heirlooms. From the back of the crowd, Rose pushed her way forward, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with disbelief. She took one look at her sister's lifeless body and collapsed to her knees, a broken sob tearing from her throat. Jonathan moved to stop her, to pull her back, but she reached out, grasping her sister's cold, lifeless hand, whispering Lily's name as though her words might bring her back. Her tears dripped onto the floor, mingling with the dust and casting a somber reflection in the dim lantern light. Jonathan wanted to comfort her, to say something that might soothe the unbearable pain he saw on her face. But there were no words for this, no comfort that could ease the horror that had descended upon them all. All he could do was stand there, his heart breaking for the girl before him, for the life that had been so cruelly snatched away, and for the darkness he feared had only just begun to reveal itself. Slowly he lifted his head, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, meeting each face that stared back at him, some pale with fear, others tight with grim determination. "This is no ordinary death," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper, "but something evil is at work here." The word sent a ripple of unease through the villagers, whispers rising again as they glanced at each other, their faces filled with fear and doubt. It was an accusation, a recognition of something that had always lurked in the shadows, but had never dared to step fully into the light. And now, as they stood in the presence of death, they all felt it, an ancient, dark force that had lain dormant, now awakened by something beyond their understanding. Jonathan knew he needed answers, but as he looked at Lily's lifeless form, the chilling reality settled over him. This was only the beginning. Part 2. Jonathan's warning. The air inside the small room was heavy, thick with the kind of silence that weighed on the soul. The villagers stood huddled together, eyes wide, faces drained of color, as they took in the horrifying sight of Lily's lifeless body hanging from the ceiling beam. Their whispers had died down, replaced by an oppressive quiet, as if they were standing at the edge of some dark abyss, peering into a mystery they dared not unravel. Jonathan, the elder, felt the tension radiating from the crowd like waves, pressing against his own mounting fear. His mind raced back to a day not long ago, a memory that now filled him with an unsettling clarity. He had been in the marketplace on an ordinary day, when he had passed a small, shabby tent with a sign marked by strange symbols. Inside sat a soothsayer, an ancient figure wrapped in layers of fabric that seemed to blend into the shadows. The soothsayer's eyes had met Jonathan's, piercing and knowing, as if he saw straight into Jonathan's soul. "Death walks near your village," the old man had whispered in a raspy voice. "It hungers, a dark presence stirs, waiting to claim what it desires. Beware the signs, elder, the innocent will be taken first." At the time, Jonathan had brushed it off as the ramblings of an eccentric old man, but now, as he looked at Lily's lifeless form, a chill crept through his veins. The soothsayer's words rang in his ears, a dreadful prophecy that had come to life in the most horrific way. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Jonathan turned to face the villagers, his expression grave. His gaze settled on Rose, who knelt at the foot of her sister's body, her hands shaking as she reached out, longing to touch her sister one last time. But Jonathan stepped forward, his voice low and filled with urgency. "Do not touch her," he commanded, the edge in his tone stopping Rose's hand midair. She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face a mixture of confusion and grief, but Jonathan held her gaze, his own eyes haunted and filled with a fear he could no longer contain. "None of you," he continued, his voice firmer now as he addressed the crowd. "No one is to touch her body. There is something wrong here, something beyond our understanding." A murmur rippled through the villagers, uneasy etched on their faces as they exchanged wary glances. Jonathan could see the disbelief in some of their eyes, the way they looked at him as though he were succumbing to superstition. But there were others who understood, who felt the dark presence that seemed to coil in the air around them like a waiting serpent. A middle-aged man, his voice shaky yet defiant, spoke up from the back of the crowd. "What are you saying, Jonathan? She's just a girl. A tragedy, yes, but curses? Darkness? You're scaring everyone." Jonathan's gaze didn't waver, his expression set with the weight of his own fear and conviction. "I know how this sounds," he said, his voice calm but edged with a warning. "But I've seen things in my years, things I never wanted to see again. There is a presence here, something that defies reason, and it has taken Lily." He looked around, his eyes hardening as he saw the growing unease reflected in the faces of his people. "We are dealing with forces we cannot see, and we cannot understand. If we disturb her body, if we touch her, we risk waking something dark and insatiable." Rose's sobs filled the silence that followed, her body shaking as she clutched her arms to her chest. Her grief was raw, and the anguish etched on her face made Jonathan's heart ache. She looked up at him, her voice trembling as she pleaded she was my sister. I need to say goodbye." Jonathan's resolve faltered for a moment, the sight of her pain cutting through his heart like a blade. But the memory of the soothsayer's warning returned, and he knew he couldn't let sentiment cloud his judgment. If he allowed even a single hand to touch Lily's body, he feared it would unleash a darkness none of them could control. Gently, he knelt beside Rose, placing a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft but unwavering. "I know how much you loved her," he whispered, his words filled with the weight of his own sorrow. "But believe me when I say this, if you touch her now, you may never find peace again. Lily is beyond our reach, Rose. We cannot risk bringing something else back with us." The villagers watched, the fear in their eyes deepening as they took in Jonathan's words. There was something about his tone, the way he spoke with such certainty, that unsettled them. It was as if he knew something they didn't, a truth that lingered in the shadows of his mind, a fear that ran deeper than anything they could comprehend. One by one they stepped back, some muttering prayers, others casting nervous glances toward the door, as though they could escape the evil that had rooted itself in their village. A young mother clutched her child tightly, whispering reassurances that she didn't believe herself, while an old woman crossed herself repeatedly, her lips moving in silent prayer. Jonathan rose, his expression grave as he addressed the crowd once more. "I must go," he said, his voice filled with a determination that surprised even him. "There is someone who may be able to help us, someone who understands the old ways, who knows how to break curses. I will find him and bring him here. Until then, no one is to touch Lily's body. Do you understand?" The villagers nodded, though their expressions were a mixture of fear and doubt. They didn't fully understand what Jonathan was asking of them, but they knew enough to obey. The horror of Lily's death, the unnatural stillness of her body, was enough to convince them, if only for now. As Jonathan turned to leave, he cast one last look at Lily's body, hanging in the dim light of the room, her pale face almost serene in death. A chill ran through him, the soothsayer's warning echoing in his mind, "Death walks near your village." It hungers, he knew that Lily's death was only the beginning. The darkness had been awakened, and it would not rest until it had taken what it desired. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the journey ahead. There was no time to waste. Every second that passed was a second that the curse deepened its hold on the village, its shadow creeping ever closer. With a final nod to the crowd, Jonathan turned and left, his footsteps echoing in the silence, leaving behind a room filled with fear, grief, and the lingering presence of something ancient, something dark, that had claimed the innocent and would stop at nothing to consume them all. The villagers watched him go, their hearts pounding as they clung to one another, each of them feeling the shadow of death brush against their souls, whispering that this was only the beginning of the horror that awaited them. Part 3. The Prophecy of Doom. As Jonathan left the darkened room where Lily's body hung like a twisted emblem of doom, he could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him, a cold ache in his chest that made every step heavier than the last. Outside, the villagers had dispersed, retreating to the safety of their homes, though he knew there would be no comfort in the shadows that awaited them. Their eyes had been filled with terror, their bodies stiff with the awareness that a presence far darker than they could imagine had now claimed their quiet village. Jonathan could barely focus on the path in front of him as his mind whirled, returning to a day he had tried so hard to forget, a day that had seemed nothing more than an odd encounter at the time, but now crept back into his memory with an eerie clarity. Months before, as he walked through the marketplace, he had passed an old tent that seemed out of place, covered in dusty cloth adorned with strange symbols, barely standing among the bustling stalls. He remembered pausing, drawn by an inexplicable sense of curiosity. The cloth was deep, dark red, fraying at the edges, the color of dried blood. The air around the tent felt thicker, charged with something that made his skin prickle. As he drew closer, a voice, soft yet cutting through the hum of the marketplace, called out to him. "Elder, would you care to know what lies in the shadow of tomorrow?" He had turned, finding himself face to face with a soothsayer unlike any he had seen before. The man's eyes were sharp and unsettling, like twin coals burning in his face. His age was indeterminate. He seemed ancient and young all at once, with a voice that carried an unnatural weight. The soothsayer's gaze held him captive, as if he could see into the depths of Jonathan's soul, to the fears and secrets that lay buried there. Jonathan had felt an uneasy shiver, but forced a smile, attempting to mask his discomfort. "I'm not one for fortune-telling," he had said lightly, dismissing the man's gaze with a polite nod. He was not a man easily swayed by superstition. He'd seen enough of life to know that most tales of curses and omens were crafted in the minds of frightened villagers. But something about the soothsayer made him pause. "Are you certain?" the man had murmured, his eyes never leaving Jonathan's face. "I see something coming. A darkness that has slept for centuries, now stirring, hungry for life. It moves silently, unseen. But it is patient." Jonathan had scoffed, shaking his head. He hadn't come to the market to be frightened by airy predictions. Yet, just as he was about to turn away, the soothsayer's words struck with an unexpected sharpness. "The innocent will be the first to fall," the man continued, his voice barely more than a whisper, yet each word seemed to echo in Jonathan's mind. "They will be taken, claimed by something that dwells between worlds, a darkness older than this village itself." The man's eyes had turned glassy, his voice drifting into an almost trance-like state. "Death will not come with a single blow," he murmured. "It will creep in slow, unseen, until there is no escape." A chill had run down Jonathan's spine, though he had forced a laugh. "You're a storyteller, I'll give you that," he said, shaking off the lingering feeling of dread as he left the man behind. In his mind, he had dismissed it all as the theatrics of a desperate old fortune-teller hoping to make a coin or two, but now the memory haunted him like a spectre. The words replayed in his mind, each one sharper and more terrifying than before. He couldn't deny that the soothsayer's prophecy seemed to be unfurling before his eyes, like a carefully woven tapestry of doom wrapping itself around the village, strand by chilling strand. As he walked through the deserted streets, every shadow seemed to lengthen, reaching out to him, as if reminding him of the old man's warning. The image of Lily's body flashed in his mind again, her pale, lifeless form swaying gently in the darkened room, her face frozen in a final, silent scream. The soothsayer had spoken of the innocent falling first, claimed by something ancient and insidious. And here she was, a young girl on the cusp of life, taken in a way that seemed far too cruel, too calculated. Jonathan's heart thudded heavily in his chest as he tried to rationalize, to explain it away, but each logical thought was swallowed by the ever-growing certainty that the darkness the soothsayer had foretold was real, alive, and breathing its cold breath upon the village. The road felt endless, stretching on, as if it were trying to trap him in his own mind. He forced himself to look away from the shadows dancing at the edge of his vision, to ignore the whispers that seemed to drift on the wind, just at the edge of hearing, calling him back to the cursed house where Lily's body still hung. But even as he walked, the questions pressed against his mind like an iron weight. Had he missed the signs? Had he ignored warnings that were meant to save them all? Each step was a battle against his growing guilt, the gnawing sense that he had been too quick to dismiss something he should have taken seriously. Jonathan reached the outskirts of the village, where the trees loomed taller, their twisted branches forming jagged shapes in the moonlight. He stopped, feeling a presence around him, a palpable, almost suffocating weight in the air, as if the very earth held its breath, waiting. The wind rustled through the trees, and he felt the chill seep deeper into his bones. He had heard tales of curses, of villages haunted by ancient forces that couldn't be seen or understood, but he had never truly believed them, dismissing them as stories to scare children into good behavior. Yet tonight the line between myth and reality had blurred, and he felt as if he were caught in the web of a nightmare that refused to let him go. He remembered the soothsayer's final words he had laughed off but now felt etched in his mind like a scar. You will be powerless against it. But if you choose to ignore this warning, it will not be the first life, nor the last. The thought filled him with a helpless dread. For the first time in his life, Jonathan, the wise elder, the man who had guided this village through countless hardships, felt truly and utterly powerless. There was no action he could take, no words he could offer that would shield them from this unseen terror. He could only hope that the one person he had set out to find, the one he had heard whispers of, a man who was said to have knowledge of the old ways, of rituals that could cleanse and protect, would hold answers to save his people. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue forward, though each step felt like he was sinking deeper into the unknown. He had faced storms, famine, sickness. He had led his people through every imaginable hardship. But nothing had prepared him for this, for the creeping horror that seemed to claw at the edges of his sanity, whispering that he had already failed, that the darkness would consume them all before he returned. As the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the distant, echoing sound of Lily's scream, a sound that Jonathan knew would haunt him for the rest of his life, he walked on, hoping against hope that he could find a way to break the prophecy's hold. But in his heart a seed of doubt had already taken root, whispering that he was too late, that the darkness had already claimed its first victim, and was hungry for more. Part 4. The Decaying Corpse. The dawn broke with a dull, grey light, casting a heavy pall over the village that seemed to seep into the bones of every person there. The morning air, which should have been crisp and fresh, was thick, carrying a faint but unmistakable odor that made the villagers wrinkle their noses as they went about their tasks. A sense of unease had settled over them, an intangible dread that whispered of something dark and unholy lingering in their midst. As the hours passed, the scent grew stronger, transforming from a faint hint to a vile, overpowering stench that seemed to come from every direction. It hung in the air like a physical presence, curling through the narrow streets, slipping under doors, creeping through open windows. It was a smell of decay, of rot, of death, unnaturally strong, as though something more than a single body had begun to spoil in the heart of their village. By midday, the source was clear to everyone. The smell was coming from the small house at the edge of the village, where Lily's body still lay. Whispers filled the air as the villagers exchanged uneasy glances, fear flickering in their eyes as they glanced toward the house, their hands trembling as they pulled their collars over their noses in a futile attempt to ward off the stench. Inside, Lily's body was changing, decaying at a rate that defied reason. Her once pale skin had taken on a sickly, mottled hue, turning shades of green and black as patches of rot spread across her face and arms. Her hair, once dark and soft, was now brittle, falling in clumps that gathered in grim piles around her. The flesh on her hands had begun to shrink, pulling taut over her bones, and her lips were twisted into a ghastly grimace that made it look as though she was silently screaming. Rose, who had been keeping vigil by her sister's side, finally retreated, her face ashen as she stumbled out into the open air, gagging, her eyes filled with horror and grief. She had tried to ignore the sight, to remember her sister as she had been in life, but the transformation was too grotesque, too unnaturally fast. It was as if some dark force were feeding on Lily's remains, hastening her decay, tainting her memory with a nightmare that could never be forgotten. The villagers began to gather in small groups, speaking in hushed voices, casting nervous glances toward the house. Some of them crossed themselves, whispering prayers under their breath, while others murmured about curses and evil spirits. Fear was taking root, spreading like a shadow over their hearts, making even the bravest among them shiver. "It isn't right," one woman muttered, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "A body doesn't decay like that, not in just a day. It's as if something's feeding on her." Others nodded, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. "Jonathan told us not to touch her," another man replied, his voice trembling. "But how can we leave her like this? That smell is poisoning the air, filling our homes. What if it brings sickness to the village?" The murmurs grew louder, a chorus of rising dread as more and more villagers began to question Jonathan's instructions. They respected him, trusted him, but this was beyond anything they had ever known. They had seen death before, had buried loved ones, friends, family, but never had they witnessed anything like this, a decay so swift and foul that it felt as though the very air around them were turning sour. By evening the stench was unbearable, clinging to everything like an invisible stain, filling the village with an oppressive weight that no amount of fresh air could lift. Even those who had been resolute, determined to respect Jonathan's wishes, began to waver, their fear mingling with frustration, their patience thinning under the unrelenting smell of death. In the fading light, a group of villagers gathered outside the house, their faces set with grim determination. They had endured enough the thought of spending another night with that stench in their nostrils. That decay seeping into their homes was more than they could bear. One of the men, a burly figure with a rough voice, stepped forward, speaking louder than he normally would, his words filled with the desperate resolve of a man pushed to his limits. "This isn't naturally declared," his voice carrying through the air. "Jonathan may have his reasons, but he isn't the one choking on this stench, living in the shadow of whatever this is." He gestured toward the house, his face twisting with disgust. "We should bury her now, before this curse spreads any further." A few others nodded in agreement, their faces mirroring his fear and frustration. They were tired, scared, unwilling to spend another night haunted by the smell of rot and the weight of a darkness they didn't understand. To them, burying Lily seemed like the only way to put an end to this nightmare, to cleanse the air and restore some semblance of peace. But not everyone was convinced. An older woman, her hands clasped tightly around a small cross, shook her head, her voice soft but filled with a quiet conviction. "Jonathan warned us," she said, her gaze steady. "He told us not to touch her. He said it was for our own safety, that there were forces at work here we can't understand." Her words sparked a fresh wave of fear, a reminder of the elder's warning, the authority in his voice that had spoken of something dark and unholy, something that would not take kindly to being disturbed. But even this fear couldn't quell the sense of urgency that had gripped the villagers. They felt trapped, caught between their respect for Jonathan and their growing horror at the sight and smell of Lily's rapidly decomposing body. "We're damned if we leave her, and we're damned if we bury her," muttered another man, his voice filled with a helpless anger. "But I'll be damned if I have to spend another night breathing in the rot of the dead." At that, a murmur of agreement rippled through the group, their fear hardening into resolve. They would take matters into their own hands. They would bury Lily and put an end to this festering decay that seemed to cling to their very souls. Whatever curse lingered, whatever force Jonathan feared, they were willing to risk it if it meant ridding themselves of this horror. Roseau had been standing at the edge of the group, listening to their words with tear-stained cheeks, suddenly spoke, her voice raw and filled with desperation. "Please, let me be the one to lay her to rest. She's my sister. I should be the one to see her." Of her words softened the anger in their eyes, replacing it with a deep sadness. They nodded, granting her permission, understanding the need for a sister's final goodbye. Rose stepped forward, her steps heavy, her heart breaking with each one. She wanted to remember Lily as she had been, laughing, full of life, her eyes bright with dreams. But as she neared the doorway, the overwhelming stench of decay clawed at her throat, filling her with a visceral revulsion that threatened to consume her grief. She pushed open the door, her hands trembling, and forced herself to look at her sister one last time. What she saw shattered her remaining resolve. Lily's body had deteriorated beyond recognition, her face sunken, her skin mottled and dark. Her mouth was twisted, her eyes sunken hollows, and a swarm of flies had begun to gather around her, their buzzing filling the silent room with an ominous hum. Rose stumbled back, tears streaming down her face as she choked on the stench, on the sight of her sister's grotesque transformation. This wasn't Lily. This wasn't the girl she had loved, the sister she had grown up with. This was something else, something wrong, a cruel mockery of the life that had once filled her. Behind her, the villagers watched, their faces pale, their resolve faltering as they took in the horror that lay before them. They had hoped that burying Lily would bring peace, but now, standing at the edge of this nightmare, they felt only dread, a deep, gnawing fear that they were trespassing into something far beyond their understanding. As night fell and the shadows grew long, the villagers stood in silence, each of them weighed down by the stench, by the unnatural decay, by the feeling that they had stepped too close to a darkness that was now watching them, waiting. Part 5. The Defiance. As darkness fell, the foul stench that had haunted the village all day grew thicker, coiling around every home, choking every breath. It was as though the decay was alive, reaching into the hearts of the villagers, gnawing at their nerves, heightening their fear. Families gathered in their homes, each person struggling to suppress the feeling that something unholy was consuming their village from within. They could smell it in the air, Lily's unnatural decay, and it seemed to seep into the walls, into their very skin. Children clung to their parents, their innocent faces etched with confusion and fright, while the adults exchanged fearful glances, wondering how much more they could bear. By now the fear was overpowering, transforming into a dark, simmering frustration. They had waited, obeyed Jonathan's orders, yet the stench only grew stronger, the decay faster. The darkness of the night seemed endless, heavy, pressing down on them as if daring them to act. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, a small group of villagers gathered outside, their faces pale but determined. Their fear had been replaced with a desperate resolve. Among them were men with furrowed brows and clenched fists, women holding their shawls close to their faces, and a few elderly villagers who had lived through hardship, yet had never known fear like this. Each of them had reached their breaking point. "We've endured enough," said Mark, a burly man whose voice usually carried authority. Tonight, however, it was thick with barely suppressed anger. "Jonathan isn't here. He went off to find someone who might help, but we don't know if he'll even come back. Meanwhile, we're left here to rot along with." That he spat, unable to even look in the direction of the house where Lily's body lay. His words stirred the crowd, their anger surfacing alongside their fear. They were tired of feeling helpless, tired of breathing in the vile stench of death. A murmur of agreement spread through them, each voice low, hesitant, but tinged with a rising determination. An older woman named Marta nodded, her face pinched with grief and exhaustion. "The longer we wait, the stronger it gets," she whispered. "That smell, it's not just rot. It's something unnatural, something evil. It's light. It's spreading, feeding on us." The villagers looked at one another, their faces drawn, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The idea of breaking Jonathan's command, of defying the elder they had always trusted, was terrifying. But the horror that had overtaken their lives was even worse. The smell, the decay, the feeling of something unseen lurking in every corner, it was too much. "Jonathan is wise," Martha continued, her voice steady. "But he's not here. We can't keep living like this. It's killing us slowly, eating at our minds." She paused, her voice catching as she looked toward the house. Maybe burying her will bring peace. Maybe then we can breathe again." The crowd murmured in agreement, their desperation fueling their resolve. Together, they turned toward the house, each step slow, hesitant, as though they were walking toward something sacred and cursed. The stench grew thicker as they approached, suffocating, making even the strongest among them gag. The flickering torches they carried cast eerie shadows, their light dancing across the ground like twisted fingers reaching toward them. As they reached the house, Rose appeared in the doorway, her face pale and tear-streaked, her eyes wide with a mix of grief and horror. She clutched the frame, blocking their way, her small figure trembling yet unyielding. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "Please don't touch her. Jonathan, he said it was for our safety. He told us to wait." Her words fell on hardened ears, the villagers' patience long worn thin. They glanced at one another, their expressions resolute. Mark stepped forward, his eyes filled with a determination that bordered on desperation. "Rose, he said softly, though there was an edge in his tone. We can't wait any longer. This thing, whatever it is not natural. We need to lay her to rest. But she's my sister, Rose cried, her voice cracking as she clung to the doorframe, her fingers digging into the wood. If you bury her, what if it makes things worse? What if it angers whatever's out there? The crowd shifted uneasily, but their desperation overpowered their caution. Another villager, a young woman named Helen, placed a hand on Rose's shoulder, her voice gentle but firm. Rose, we understand. This is hard for all of us, but you've seen what's happening. If we leave her like this, we're all in danger. Rose's eyes filled with tears, her face twisting in anguish as she looked back toward the room where her sister's body lay, a grotesque shadow of the girl she had once been. She knew they were right, the stench, the rapid decay. The feeling of something wrong had been gnawing at her too, but the thought of burying Lily, of sealing her away in the cold ground, felt like a betrayal, as if she were abandoning her sister to something far worse than death. But the crowd moved forward, their resolve set. They eased her aside, ignoring her pleas, their footsteps heavy as they entered the house, faces twisted with grim determination. Inside, the sight of Lily's body was even more horrifying than they had imagined. Her skin had shriveled, pulling taut over her bones, leaving her mouth agape in a silent scream, her once bright eyes sunken, darkened by death's cruel hand. Her limbs had stiffened, twisted in unnatural angles, as though her body had resisted the decay that had overtaken her. The sight made their stomachs churn, yet it steeled their resolve. Mark, swallowing hard, stepped forward, covering his nose as he reached for Lily's body. His hand shook, the unnatural chill of her corpse seeping through his skin. Together with another man, they carefully lifted her, their faces pale, eyes averted as they tried to avoid the horrific sight before them. The silence was thick, only the faint rustle of their movements disturbing the unnatural stillness. Rose watched in despair, her body shaking with silent sobs, as she followed them outside. The villagers had prepared a simple grave on the outskirts of the village, a shallow pit that felt cold, unwelcoming, yet strangely final. The wind had picked up, sending a chill through them as they carried Lily to her final resting place. They lowered her body into the earth, the torches casting strange shadows that seemed to dance around the grave, as though something unseen were watching. The villagers stood in silence, their hearts pounding, each of them feeling the weight of the act they were committing. They weren't just burying a body, they were burying their fears, their guilt, their desperate hope that this would end the nightmare. Mark reached for the shovel, his hand shaking as he scooped up the first mound of earth, pausing only a moment before he let it fall, the dirt landing with a hollow thud. The sound echoed in the night, a chilling finality that sent shivers down their spines. One by one, others followed, adding layer after layer, their breaths coming shallow and rapid, as though they were racing against an unseen force. Rose watched, her face pale, her eyes filled with unshed tears as she clutched her arms around herself, her heart breaking with each scoop of earth that covered her sister. She felt as though she were watching a nightmare, her body frozen, unable to scream, to cry, to stop them. Her sister was gone, swallowed by the earth, the last remnant of her life fading into the shadows. Finally, the grave was filled, the earth packed down, sealing Lily away. The villagers stood around it, their heads bowed, each of them hoping, praying that this would be enough, that by laying her to rest they had laid to rest whatever darkness had come to claim her. But as they turned to leave, a strange sound echoed through the night, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to rise from the ground itself, twisting through the air like a dying breath. The villagers froze, their eyes wide, hearts pounding, as they looked back at the grave, fear pooling in their stomachs. In the silence that followed, they could feel it, the air growing colder, heavier, as though something unseen had awoken, watching them, waiting. They exchanged nervous glances, their earlier resolve fading, replaced by the chilling realization that perhaps, in their desperation, they had made a terrible mistake. And as they walked back to the village, their footsteps hollow, the darkness seemed to close in around them, thick and unrelenting, as though the grave they had dug was only the beginning of the horror that awaited them. Part 6. The Rising Darkness. The night was thick, suffocating, as if the air itself was saturated with something unseen and malevolent. The villagers stood in a silent circle, their eyes locked on Lily's simple wooden coffin as it was lowered into the shallow grave they had dug hastily in their desperation. Each person's breath clouded in front of them, though the air had suddenly grown unnaturally cold, a biting chill that seeped into their bones. Mark and the others who had dared to defy Jonathan's warning glanced at one another, their faces pale, their eyes betraying a nervous unease that no amount of bravery could mask. They had thought burying Lily would bring them peace, would end the stench, the decay, the unnatural horrors that had plagued them since her death. But now, as the coffin touched the bottom of the grave with a dull, final thud, an unsettling silence blanketed the village, as though the night itself were holding its breath. A sharp wind cut through the air, swirling the loose dirt around the grave, scattering it over their feet and faces. The torches they held flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced and twisted, creating grotesque shapes that seemed to creep and lunge at them in the dim light. The shadows stretched longer and darker, slithering across the ground, entwining themselves with the figures of the villagers as though they had a life of their own. Rose stood closest to the grave, her hands clasped tightly to her chest, her face streaked with fresh tears. She felt the same chill that gripped the others, but for her, it was worse, a sickening dread that coiled around her heart, squeezing until she could hardly breathe. Her eyes were fixed on her sister's coffin, her mind racing with memories of Lily's laughter, her bright smile, her gentle presence. But now, Lily's body lay sealed within a wooden box, trapped beneath layers of earth, severed forever from the world of the living. And though Rose's grief was raw, sharp as broken glass, a darker fear crept through her veins, whispering that her sister's soul had been disturbed. As the villagers picked up their shovels, shoveling mounds of cold, damp earth over the coffin, a strange sound seemed to rise from the ground, a faint, almost imperceptible murmur, like voices whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. The villagers paused, glancing around in confusion, unsure if they had truly heard something, or if their minds were playing tricks on them. But the sound grew louder, weaving through the night like a sinister lullaby, an unsettling chorus of voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The whispers filled the air, swirling around the grave, wrapping around the villagers like a fog. Their words were unclear, distorted, yet filled with a cold malice that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. It was as though the ground itself was speaking, angry, resentful, filled with a dark hunger that had lain dormant for centuries and now, at last, was awakening. Rose shivered, her hands tightening around her arms as she tried to block out the sound, to push away the sensation of invisible eyes watching her, studying her with a dark, insatiable curiosity. She wanted to run, to flee from this place, but her legs felt rooted to the ground, as though some unseen force held her there, compelling her to witness what they had done. One of the men, his face pale and drawn, took a shaky step back, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his eyes darting around, wide and fearful. The others nodded, their faces mirroring his terror. The whispers had grown louder, a chorus of angry murmurs that seemed to echo from beneath the earth, as though something buried deep below was struggling to rise, clawing its way up from the shadows to reclaim what was taken. Mark, trying to steady himself, raised his voice over the whispers. It's just the wind," he said, though his voice wavered, betraying the fear that gripped him. He forced himself to shovel another mound of dirt into the grave, trying to ignore the strange, icy sensation creeping up his spine, the feeling that something was watching him from the darkness, something hungry. But with every shovelful of earth that fell upon the coffin, the chill deepened. The whispers grew sharper, angrier, as though the ground itself resented their intrusion, their attempt to bury what had already claimed its space in death. The shadows seemed to thicken, pressing in around them, distorting the shapes of the trees, casting strange, twisted figures across the ground that writhed and pulsed with a life of their own. Rose's heart hammered in her chest, a primal fear clawing at her, whispering that they had made a grave mistake, that this wasn't the end, but the beginning of something far darker. She looked at the villagers, their faces pale and strained, their eyes wide with terror as they tried to shovel the dirt faster, their hands trembling, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. Suddenly a violent gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the torches, plunging them into a thick, suffocating darkness. Gasps and startled cries filled the air as the villagers scrambled, their hands reaching out blindly, grasping for one another in the pitch black. The only sound was the frantic rustling of their movements and the ever-present, chilling whispers that seemed to grow louder, clearer in the absence of light. And then, in the darkness, a voice low guttural, dripping with malice rose above the whispers, cutting through the night like a blade. It was a voice that didn't belong to the world of the living, a voice that spoke of ancient places, dark shadows, and a hunger that could never be sated. Leave. Now the words were a command, laced with a malevolence so intense it sent a wave of terror through every villager, freezing them in place. Rose felt her heart stop, her breath hitching as the words echoed in her mind, each syllable vibrating with a dark power that made her blood run cold. The voice fell silent, but the presence lingered, oppressive, filling the air with a sense of doom that weighed on their souls. No one moved, no one spoke, each of them paralyzed by the overwhelming fear that if they dared to take another step, dared to disturb the grave further, something worse than death would befall them. At last, one of the women, her voice barely a whimper, broke the silence. What have we done? Her words hung in the air, a question that had no answer, a fear that had no comfort. They had thought burying Lily would bring peace, would end the horrors that had plagued their village. But now, as they stood in the pitch black, surrounded by whispers and shadows, they realized they had awakened something far darker, something that had been waiting in the earth, hungry, eager to claim them all. Mark swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he reached for the remaining dirt, his fingers numb with cold, his mind racing with fear. We have to finish," he whispered, though his voice was thick with dread. "If we leave her half buried, if we leave it unfinished." But the others shook their heads, their faces pale, their eyes filled with terror. The whispers were growing louder again, more insistent, filling the air with a malevolent energy that made their skin crawl, that made their hearts pound with a dread they couldn't escape. They wanted to leave, to flee this cursed ground, to escape the darkness that had risen around them like a living thing. Without another word, the villagers turned, their fear overtaking their resolve, their feet stumbling as they fled into the night, abandoning the half-filled grave, leaving Lily's coffin partially exposed, an open invitation to the shadows that had come to claim her. Rose hesitated, her eyes locked on the grave, her heart torn between fear and love, between the horror that gripped her and the memory of her sister's laughter, her warmth, her kindness. But even she couldn't stand against the darkness that pressed in around her, a tangible force that seemed to push her away, to command her to leave. With a final, heartbroken glance, she turned and ran, following the others into the darkness, her steps echoing through the silent night, the whispers fading but never truly disappearing, lingering like a curse, like a promise of something yet to come. And as the villagers disappeared into the shadows, leaving the grave behind, the night grew colder, darker, the whispers settling into the earth, filling it with an ancient, insatiable hunger. For now it waited, but the villagers knew, somewhere deep within, that this was only the beginning. The darkness had been disturbed, the shadows had awakened, and there would be no peace until it had claimed what it desired. Part 7. The Sage Arrives. The village lay under a thick, suffocating silence as dawn broke, casting a pale, ghostly light over the houses. The villagers stirred restlessly, their sleep haunted by nightmares of shadows and whispers, by the bone-deep chill that had settled over them ever since they had buried Lily. Though they had sought to put an end to the horrors, to silence the lingering stench and decay, it felt as though they had only invited something darker into their lives. As the first rays of sun crept over the horizon, the silence was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps, a rhythmic, desperate beat that echoed through the village. From the edge of the forest, Jonathan emerged, his face drawn, his eyes haunted. His clothes were rumpled, dusted with dirt and leaves, and his hands trembled as he clutched his walking staff. Behind him walked a figure shrouded in a long dark cloak, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. The villagers, drawn by the noise, gathered at the edge of the square, their faces pale with a mixture of hope and fear as they watched the two figures approach. Jonathan's gaze swept over the crowd, his expression grim as he gestured toward the cloaked figure beside him. "This is the sage," he announced, his voice barely more than a whisper, though it carried an unearthly authority. "I brought him to help us, but he fears that we may have already done something we cannot undo." The sage stepped forward, his movements deliberate, controlled, as though every step carried a weight known only to him. Though his face was hidden, the villagers could feel his eyes upon them, piercing and unyielding, as if he were seeing past their flesh into their very souls. The air grew colder as he approached, an unnatural chill that made the villagers shiver, their breath visible in the morning light. One of the villagers, a woman named Marta, clasped her hands together, her voice trembling as she spoke. We buried her, Sage, we thought. We thought it would bring us peace, but something has changed. The air feels wrong, and there are whispers. The sage tilted his head, his voice low and gravelly, resonating with an ancient authority that made the villagers stand straighter, as if in the presence of a power far beyond their understanding. You have disturbed forces that should not be disturbed, he said, his tone heavy with quiet reproach. By laying her to rest on cursed ground, you have invited darkness to walk among you. The shadows have tasted death, and they are hungry. The villagers shifted uneasily, glancing at one another with a growing sense of dread. They had been desperate, frantic to end the nightmare, but they had not anticipated that their actions might only worsen the horror that lurked in their village. Jonathan cleared his throat, his voice thick with regret. We didn't understand, he murmured, his eyes downcast. We thought it was just a body. But now we know that something far darker is at work. The sage's gaze moved to Jonathan, his head inclining slightly. We must unearth her, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. We must cleanse the ground and lay her spirit to rest properly, or the curse will spread. Shadows do not linger in one place, they infect, they consume. If we do not act now, you will be consumed by what you have awakened. The villagers' faces paled, their expressions twisting with a mixture of fear and guilt. To dig up Lily's grave, to disturb her resting place once more, was unthinkable, yet the thought of ignoring the sage's words was even worse. They knew, deep down, that they had made a grave mistake, and now the weight of their actions pressed down on them, thick and suffocating. Marta stepped forward, her hands trembling as she clasped them together, her voice barely more than a whisper. If we dig her up, will it stop the whispers? Will it end whatever we've done? The sage regarded her in silence, and though they could not see his eyes, they felt his gaze boring into them, as though he were assessing the depth of their fear, their desperation. If we act swiftly, there may be a chance to break the curse, he said finally. But know this, once the shadows have tasted life, they do not let go easily. You must be prepared for what lies beneath the earth, for it may be far worse than what you buried. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, each face filled with fear and uncertainty. They had already been haunted by nightmares, by shadows that crept at the edges of their vision, by whispers that seemed to echo from beneath the ground. But the thought of facing whatever lay in that grave, of unearthing what they had hoped to bury forever, filled them with a dread so intense it stole their breath. Yet they knew they had no choice. Jonathan looked over the villagers, his gaze somber, his voice steady as he spoke. We have to do this. We can't ignore what we've done. If there's a chance, even the slightest chance to end this, we have to take it. Slowly, reluctantly, the villagers nodded, each of them filled with a sense of resigned dread. Together, they gathered what tools they needed, shovels and torches, their hands shaking as they clutched them tightly. The sage led them to the outskirts of the village, to the grave where they had buried Lily just the night before. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows lengthening, twisting, as if mocking them, daring them to proceed. They reached the grave, and for a moment the villagers simply stood in silence, staring at the mound of earth that had once promised them peace, but now held only a deep, unrelenting dread. The torches cast flickering shadows across the ground, and the whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, rising from beneath the earth like a dark melody that filled the night. Mark, his face pale and drawn, stepped forward, clutching his shovel with white-knuckled hands. He took a deep breath, glancing at the sage for reassurance, but the sage only nodded, his expression unreadable beneath the hood. With a shaky exhale, Mark plunged his shovel into the earth, the sound harsh and jarring in the quiet night. The others followed suit, their movements hesitant, fearful, as though each scoop of dirt brought them closer to something unspeakable. The earth was cold and damp, clinging to their shovels, to their fingers, as though it too resisted their attempts to uncover what lay below. As they dug, the whispers grew louder, sharper, filling the air with a malevolence that made their skin crawl. Shadows danced around them, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways, casting grotesque shapes that seemed to writhe and pulse with life. The villagers' breaths came in short, shallow gasps, their hearts pounding as they unearthed the Lily's coffin, the wood now dark and warped, as though touched by something foul. The sage stepped forward, raising a hand signaling them to stop. His voice was low, commanding, resonating with an ancient power that seemed to silence even the whispers. "Stand back," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. The villagers obeyed, retreating a few paces as the sage knelt beside the coffin. He placed his hands upon the wood, murmuring words in a language none of them recognized, words that seemed to pulse with energy, resonating with the earth itself. The ground trembled beneath them, a deep, unsettling vibration that felt like a heartbeat, ancient and malevolent. Suddenly a wail erupted from the coffin, a sound so filled with anguish and rage that it pierced their souls, freezing them in place. It was Lily's voice, but twisted, distorted, filled with the darkness that made their blood run cold. The villagers covered their ears, stumbling back, their faces twisted with horror as the sound reverberated through the air, filling them with a terror beyond words. The sage continued his chant, his voice rising above the wail, steady and unwavering. The air grew colder, the shadows pressing in around them, as though 1,000 unseen eyes watched from the darkness, waiting, hungry. The ground shook, and cracks appeared along the coffin's surface, tin fissures that glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. Finally the wail faded, replaced by a deep silence, thick and suffocating. The sage stood, his face hidden, his voice low, as he turned to the villagers. "The darkness is deep," he said, his tone filled with a solemnity that made their hearts clench. "But it is not yet beyond redemption. Take this coffin to the edge of the forest, to the ancient stones that lie beneath the old oak. There we may be able to end what you have unleashed." The villagers nodded, though their faces were filled with fear, their hands shaking as they prepared to lift the coffin. As they struggled under its weight, the whispers returned, faint but insistent, a reminder that they were not alone, that the shadows watched and waited, eager for what was to come. And as they carried Lily's coffin toward the ancient stones, they knew that whatever lay ahead, they were bound to a fate woven by their own hands, a darkness that might yet consume them all. Part 8. The Exorcism. The villagers gathered at the ancient stones beneath the towering oak, their breaths misting in the chill night air, each of them trembling with fear. The stone circle was older than the village, older than anyone could remember. They had avoided this place for generations, for it was said to be a threshold between worlds, a place where shadows clung to the earth and whispers from the other side slipped through. The sage moved with purpose, his cloak billowing as he circled the stones, muttering in a low, guttural voice that resonated through the clearing. His words were strange, twisted sounds that seemed to come from another time, each syllable vibrating with an energy that made the villagers' skin prickle. His hands traced intricate symbols in the air, marking the space around Lily's coffin, each gesture filling the clearing with a palpable, electrifying tension. Lily's body lay motionless within the coffin, her skin grey and waxy, her features distorted by the unnatural decay. The air around her seemed heavy, thick, as though something dark lingered, hidden just beyond sight, waiting. The villagers huddled together, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the sage, silently praying that he would be able to rid their village of this horror. The sage's voice grew louder, his chant rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm that reverberated through the clearing. The ancient stones seemed to pulse in response, a faint glow emanating from the symbols etched into their surfaces. Shadows writhed along the ground, twisting and curling as though alive, responding to the dark power that filled the air. "Guard your hearts," the sage called out, his voice a commanding presence that cut through the cold. "Do not let your fear open a doorway. The darkness feeds on weakness." The villagers gripped each other's hands tightly, their bodies tense, breaths shallow. They felt the darkness pressing in, an overwhelming, suffocating force that seemed to crawl over their skin, slipping into the edges of their minds. Yet none of them dared to look away, bound by a mixture of terror and desperate hope that the sage's ritual would save them all. With a sudden, violent movement, the sage raised both hands, and a gust of icy wind tore through the clearing, extinguishing their torches and plunging them into darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the stones, casting airy shadows across Lily's lifeless face. Her eyes, once closed in a final rest, suddenly snapped open, revealing eyes as pale and empty as death itself. A gasp rippled through the crowd, several villagers stumbling back, their faces twisted in horror. Lily's mouth opened slowly, impossibly wide, and from her lips came a scream, a haunting, blood-curdling wail that pierced the night, echoing through the trees, filling the clearing with a terror beyond words. It was a sound that did not belong to the world of the living, a sound that twisted and stretched, mingling with the sage's incantations, rising in a dreadful harmony that made the villagers' blood run cold. "Hold fast," the sage shouted over the scream, his voice fierce and unyielding. He continued his chant, his hands moving with a furious intensity, drawing symbols in the air, his fingers glowing with a strange, otherworldly light. His movements grew faster, more desperate, as though he were fighting against an invisible force, something ancient and malevolent that resisted his every word, every gesture. The scream intensified, filling the air with a palpable malice that bore down on the villagers, driving them to their knees. The ground trembled beneath them, the earth itself seeming to shudder under the weight of the dark power that had taken hold of Lily's body. Her hands twitched, her fingers curling into claw-like shapes, her lifeless form contorting as though something inside her was struggling to break free. Rose, who had been watching in silent horror, clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face as she took a step forward, reaching out instinctively toward her sister. But the sage's voice cut through her grief, sharp and unyielding. "Stay back. She is no longer your sister. This spirit, it is something else, something that has taken her form. You must not approach." Rose stopped, her hands shaking, her face twisted in anguish. She could hardly breathe, hardly think, her heart breaking as she watched her sister's body convulse, twisted by a dark force that had stolen her from them. The scream changed, shifting into a guttural, inhuman sound that made the villagers press their hands to their ears, their faces pale with terror. The sage raised his hands higher, his voice now a shout, each word charged with power. He moved with the precision of a man who had performed this ritual countless times, yet his face was strained, beads of sweat rolling down his forehead as he battled the entity within Lily. The ancient stones pulsed in response to his chant, the symbols etched into their surfaces glowing brighter, casting a strange flickering light across the clearing. Suddenly Lily's body arched, her spine bending at an unnatural angle, her empty eyes fixed on the sky. The villagers gasped, their hands flying to their mouths, some turning away in horror, unable to bear the sight. Her mouth opened wide again, and from deep within her came a sound, low and rumbling, filled with a darkness that sent shivers through the crowd. The sage pressed forward, his hand shaking as he reached into his cloak, pulling out a small vial filled with a thick, dark liquid. He poured it over Lily's body, the liquid sizzling and smoking as it touched her skin, filling the air with a pungent, acrid scent that stung their eyes, their throats. But the chanting grew faster, more urgent, each word hitting the air like a blow, cutting through the darkness that wrapped around them. The entity within Lily screamed, a sound filled with fury and desperation, its inhuman voice intertwining with the sage's words in a chaotic, dreadful melody. Shadows writhed across her skin, black tendrils that twisted and pulsed, fighting against the cleansing ritual, clawing at the air as though they were trying to escape. The villagers huddled together, clutching each other tightly, their eyes wide with horror as they watched the struggle unfold. Some wept, others muttered prayers under their breath, their voices trembling as they pleaded for mercy, for release from the nightmare that had consumed their lives. The sage's chant reached a fever pitch, his voice straining as he forced the dark entity back, pushing it inch by inch from Lily's body. The shadows began to retreat, the tendrils curling inward, twisting and writhing as though, in agony, their form dissipating, their strength waning under the force of his incantations. With one final, agonized scream, the shadows exploded outward, a burst of darkness that seemed to shatter against the stones, filling the clearing with a blinding light. The villagers shielded their eyes, gasping as the air cleared, the oppressive weight lifting, the silence settling over them like a long-lost comfort. When they opened their eyes, Lily's body lay still, her face peaceful, her eyes closed once more. The darkness was gone, leaving her pale and serene, untouched by the horrors that had plagued her in death. The sage stood over her, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with exhaustion, his hands trembling as he lowered them to his sides. The villagers watched in silence, their hearts filled with a strange, bittersweet relief. They had lost Lily, but they had freed her from the darkness, had broken the curse that had bound her, had saved their village from the shadows that had threatened to consume them all. Rose knelt beside her sister, her hands shaking as she brushed a lock of hair from Lily's face, her tears falling silently, mixing with the dirt and blood that covered her hands. She whispered a final goodbye, her heart heavy but filled with a quiet peace, knowing that Lily was finally at rest. The sage turned to the villagers, his voice soft, weary. The darkness has been banished, for now, but remember, shadows lie in wait, always watching. Respect the boundaries between worlds and never forget what has happened here. With those words he turned and walked into the forest, his figure fading into the shadows, leaving the villagers alone in the clearing, their hearts filled with both sorrow and a profound, trembling gratitude. They gathered around Lily's body, their faces somber, their spirits heavy yet unburdened. Together they laid her to rest, each of them carrying a piece of the night's horror in their hearts, a memory of the darkness they had faced and overcome. And as they left the ancient stones behind, the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the air lightening, the shadows retreating to the edges, where they would wait, silent and patient, for another soul to wander too close to the darkness. Part 9. A false calm. The ritual had ended, and a thick, almost unnatural silence enveloped the village. The night was still, not even a whisper of wind stirring the trees, as if the earth itself were holding its breath, waiting for something unknown. The villagers, exhausted and shaken, stood clustered together around Lily's grave, their faces etched with relief but shadowed by something darker, a fear that had burrowed deep into their souls, refusing to let go. The sage, cloaked and solemn, stood apart from the others, his face hidden beneath his hood. His shoulders slumped slightly, betraying the toll the ritual had taken on him. He breathed slowly, deeply, as though grounding himself after battling something ancient and unspeakable. Beside him, Jonathan stood silent, his face grim. The old man's eyes were tired, filled with sorrow, and something else, a quiet, unresolved dread that lingered like a shadow across his weathered face. The villagers began to disperse, some murmuring words of gratitude, others reaching out with hesitant hands to touch the sage's cloak in reverence, or simply to reassure themselves of his presence. Rose lingered near her sister's grave, her fingers lightly brushing the disturbed earth, her face streaked with tears that had yet to dry. She seemed lost, adrift, as though part of her spirit had been buried with Lily, sealed beneath the dark soil and ancient stones. The sage watched them go, his gaze turning to Jonathan, who was still standing by his side. Jonathan met his eyes, and in that single, unspoken exchange, they both understood that this night was not an ending but merely a pause, a fleeting moment of peace, a shallow breath before something deeper and darker awakened. Will they truly be safe? Jonathan asked in a low voice, barely more than a whisper. His eyes were fixed on the distant trees, which now seemed darker, more ominous, as if something malevolent waited just beyond the edge of sight, hidden within the shadows. The sage did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his cloak and drew out a small pouch filled with ashes from the ritual, sprinkling a handful over the stones around the grave. The air around them seemed to tremble, vibrating with a strange energy, as though the ground itself recognized the power and absorbed it. He muttered an incantation, ancient words that resonated with the weight of centuries, binding the earth, sealing it with a layer of protection. Finally, he looked at Jonathan, his face as unreadable as the darkness beyond the village. "For now, they are safe," he replied, his voice grave and steady. "The entity that held her is bound. But curses like this, they leave scars. The shadows we fought tonight will not vanish, they merely withdraw, waiting for another opportunity. They are patient, Jonathan. They will bide their time." Jonathan nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful yet troubled. He could feel the lingering weight in the air, a subtle wrongness that could not be banished by mere words or rituals. He thought of the curse, of the whispers that had plagued them, of the twisted shadows that had danced around Lily's body. Even now, after the exorcism, he felt as though the village was marked, branded by an evil that had left its imprint on them all. "Is there anything we can do to keep it at bay?" Jonathan asked, his voice filled with a weariness that seemed to reach down to his very bones. Something to protect the village, to keep the darkness from returning. The sage considered this, his gaze intense as he surveyed the village, the quiet homes huddled together beneath the shadow of the ancient oak tree. There are ways, he murmured, his voice contemplative. But they come at a cost. Protection requires sacrifice, a constant vigilance. And even with all precautions, the darkness will find cracks, places where it can seep through, subtle as smoke, and just as insidious. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the weight of the sage's words settling over him like a shroud. The villagers had already suffered so much the fear, the nights filled with nightmares, the taint of death that had poisoned their very air. And yet, if they were to survive, if they were to remain safe from the shadows that had claimed Lily, they would have to bear an even greater burden. The villagers were beginning to light small fires in their homes, flickering lights casting warm glows that barely seemed to touch the encroaching night. The peace that had settled over the village felt fragile, as if it might shatter at the slightest sound, the slightest hint of movement from the trees. Children clung to their parents, their eyes wide with residual fear, while the adults whispered in hushed tones, glancing nervously at the dark corners, the edges where the firelight didn't reach. Rose stood by her sister's grave, unwilling to leave, her grief heavy as the earth around her. She whispered Lily's name softly, as though calling out to her spirit, seeking some final, impossible comfort. She felt as if her sister's presence lingered, warm yet distant, just beyond reach, like the fading memory of a dream that slipped through her fingers. Rose knew that Lily was gone, that whatever had taken her was defeated, but the emptiness it left was profound, a wound that no amount of time could truly heal. The sage approached Rose, his presence quiet, respectful, as he placed a hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes meeting his calm, knowing gaze. "She is at peace now," the sage said gently, his voice soft. "You must hold to that, remember her as she was, and let the darkness go. It will not return for her." Rose nodded slowly, though her heart ached, the knowledge offering her only the smallest measure of solace. She glanced at the grave, her lips moving in a silent prayer, hoping that somehow her sister could hear her. Then, reluctantly, she allowed herself to be led away, leaving behind the weight of her sorrow, the cold soil, the shadows that lingered in her memory. As she walked back toward the village, Jonathan turned to the sage one last time, his gaze steady, resolute. If the darkness returns," he said, his voice thick with unspoken fears, "will you come back?" The sage regarded him, his face hidden in the depths of his hood, yet Jonathan felt the intensity of his gaze, the weight of ancient wisdom and burdens carried over countless years. "If it returns, I will know," the sage replied, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "But remember, Jonathan, this village must be vigilant. The shadows test boundaries, seeking entry, even as we speak. They will exploit any weakness. It is up to you to ensure that those boundaries remain strong." Jonathan swallowed, nodding, his throat tight. He watched as the sage turned away, his form blending into the darkness at the edge of the clearing. The villagers, unaware of the exchange, were already beginning to return to their homes, trying to convince themselves that the ordeal was truly over, that the worst had passed. But as Jonathan stood alone, staring into the night, he felt a familiar chill creep over him, a subtle yet insistent reminder that the peace they had fought for was fragile, temporary. He could sense the shadows lurking at the edges, pressing against the boundaries, waiting for a moment of weakness, a crack in their defenses. The quiet settled over the village once more, but this time it felt different, heavier, as though the land itself bore witness to a darkness that could not be fully banished. Jonathan knew that he would carry this night with him, that each step he took through the village, each familiar face he passed, would be marked by the memory of what they had faced, by the knowledge that the darkness was always watching, waiting. As he turned to leave the clearing, he cast one last glance at Lily's grave, his heart heavy with sorrow and a strange, lingering dread. The peace that filled the village was deceptive, a delicate veil over a threat that had not been vanquished but merely pushed back into the shadows. And in that silent understanding, Jonathan knew that they were not yet free, that the curse was contained but not defeated, that their village would forever live in the shadow of this night, bound to a darkness that lay just beyond the edge of the firelight, waiting for its chance to return.